is, the whole intention behind this project, which is probably going to take about 30 years to complete if I'm doing Isis and the Secret Doctrine, is really just to help people with their kind of studying of Theosophy, if they want to look into it more deeply, or they want to look into Blavatsky's work more deeply. I mean, there were spirits who were kind of like celebrities, like Katie King and John King were mentioned in the national press and in the international press, and there was this huge debate raging around, scientists investigating spiritual phenomena. Yeah, I mean, she particularly talked about ancient Egypt being a center of knowledge, and Pythagoras and Jesus and Moses kind of learning a lot of things from ancient Egypt, and also the idea of humanity being incredibly old and not necessarily following the path that we've been led to believe that it follows. So she talks about ancient races, she talks about Atlantis, she talks about the Lemurians before the Atlanteans, and then other kind of versions of humanity. But for Theosophists, the Atlanteans were bigger than we were, and before them there were the Lemurians, who were bigger than the Atlanteans, and it was only in the Lemurian period that humanity separated out into male and female. So the Lemurians began as giants, but they didn't reproduce in the way that we do now. So Theosophy does kind of follow that arc of humanity getting smaller and also becoming more materialistic. And the original human race was kind of non-corporeal, really kind of gaseous. So really the idea of the root races is a kind of era of humanity, and the root races go back to the first and second root races, who were kind of not really that physically formed. They were more ethereal and non-corporeal, and then you had the third root race, which is the Lemurians, and then the fourth root race, which is primarily the Atlanteans, and then we're now in the fifth root race, and then there will be another two that will develop, and we're now at the bottom of the kind of the involutionary arc. So we're just past that point of being as material and obsessed with the material world as we can possibly be. And as we move upwards, we'll develop more kind of what people might describe as, supernatural, spooky powers, more telepathy, more ability to read each other's thoughts and communicate in that way as we move into the sixth and seventh eras of humanity, or root races, if you like.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box. Today we're joined by author Moon Laramie, who discusses his new publication Blavatsky Unveiled Vol I. Now, Blavatsky's original occult masterpiece, Isis Unveiled, covers a wide range of topics from ancient Egyptian mystery schools and the Cosmogenesis to the conflict between science and spiritualism. But Blavatsky's elaborate Victorian prose can really present quite a stumbling block to the 21st century reader. So in the book, Moon Laramie addresses these linguistic challenges by rendering the original text for the first time ever into easily accessible modern English. But it also has quite a detailed set of notes and a comprehensive who's who section. It's really quite a tome. I mean, it's a serious psychedelic ride through the world of seances, skeptical scientists, multiple Earths, Atlantis, Lemuria, giants, and a vastly different view of human history. So if you're not familiar with Blavatsky, we have you covered, and Moon gives an overview of her background and life story. So don't get put off that you have to do some background reading for this to make sense. In the plus section, we get into perpetual lamps and alkahest, the universal solvent. If that sounds tempting, head on over to the podcast Patreon for the extended show and the monthly bonus content. Now, before we get into the show, I want to talk to you about a project I've been working on with creative technologist David Tidman called the Sigil Engine. So it was part of an art project really exploring technomancy. asking the question as to whether magic was possible via digital means. The way to find out, we decided, was to build something that would enable us to build a sigil via a digital format and see what happens. And then release that to the public. Now, if you don't know what a sigil is, check out Grant Morrison's legendary talk on the subject. I'll leave the link in the show notes. For those of you more familiar with sigil magic, we based the process on the Kama model blended with the standard phrase model. We used a circle instead of a square as it creatively worked better and as a nod to the Goethe. One of the things that sets it apart from similar tools, apart from it being better, is we specifically went for a beautiful aesthetic. The reason being the beauty and quality of the look and feel of how the sigil animates when it's being created. We thought it would add to the process. We thought it would kind of give a bit of mystique and mystery, which I thought would be an essential part of it feeling magical. It's still a prototype and there are lots of additions to be made, but on launch it will generate a sigil based on one's intention, which is then downloadable as a PNG and a stencil file. In due course, we plan to add CAD files to the download pack so people can 3D print their sigils or bring them to an artist or a sculptor or a jeweler who uses 3D software, and they can do whatever they want with the sigil. How you decide to charge them, well, I'll leave that to you. So the patrons of the show will be the first testers, but I will share it via Twitter and Reddit once it's good to go. Speaking of which, a big thank you to Ankh tier patrons Ariel, Marco, Steph, and Robert. Your support means a lot, and I'm very grateful. Okay, so without further ado, let's hand over to Moon Laramie. On with the show.
Well, I'm an author and a theosophist, and I principally write about theosophy. And studying theosophy, I started out looking at Isis Unveiled, which, as you're probably aware, is quite a challenging text. And when I was at the Theosophical Society, we were told that the best way to approach Blavatsky's work is to dip in and dip out of it. But I never ever do what I'm told, so I just started reading it from the first line of the first chapter. And it's really challenging because it's written in what I'd kind of term as a very high-flown Victorian style, almost kind of like a debating society style. And I found out that the average sentence in modern English is around 15 to 20 words long. But Blavatsky, she writes beautifully, but there are sentences in Isis Unveiled and I think in The Secret Doctrine that are about 200 words long. And as modern readers, it's really difficult for us to kind of access that. And the other thing about it is that she wrote it in 1877, and there are so many people that she mentions that were well known in 1877, but aren't necessarily so well known to us today. So what I decided to do was to kind of go through the text and literally modernize each sentence and each paragraph of the text so that you can kind of access those ideas more easily. Plus also to kind of produce a full who's who of everybody she mentions in the text, and also all of the references that she makes that might be quite obscure. And I just went from the basis of somebody that knows nothing about theosophy or Blavatsky. So every kind of reference is cited and explained, and all of the people that she mentions, and it's all kind of put into modern English. But it's the first 7 chapters of volume 1 of Isis Unveiled. So it's just a quarter of the book, this first volume that I've done so far.
Now I can imagine that as with most things in the kind of esoteric world, that you get real traditionalists and you get real purists. So I'd imagine that there were a few eyebrows raised at this undertaking. What's the reaction been like?
It's been very, very positive, actually. I haven't so far met anyone who's a theosophist that said that they don't approve of the idea, because I think everyone is kind of struggling to access Blavatsky's work. So I've had a very, very positive and very supportive, kind of feedback from people. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who are raising some eyebrows, but I mean, the thing is, the whole intention behind this project, which is probably going to take about 30 years to complete if I'm doing ISIS and the Secret Doctrine, is really just to help people with their kind of studying of theosophy, if they want to look into it more deeply, or they want to look into Blavatsky's work more deeply. I kind of think of, how when I was a kid in the 70s and the 80s, and we studied Shakespeare in school, we didn't have any modern English versions. We had to sit there in class writing, in modern English over the text. And nowadays there are modern English versions of Shakespeare. So I think the thing is with Blavatsky is you get further and further away from 1877. The language becomes more and more alien to us. So I see it as kind of like, that kind of helpful modern English version of a text that's difficult to access. So, you don't have to kind of, I wouldn't imagine that people would look at Blavatsky Unveiled and say, I'm only going to look at that. I mean, if you are a serious student of theosophy and serious about studying the occult and esotericism, you'd still always return to the original text, I think.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's just that thing within the kind of the kind of esoteric, kind of hermetic and metaphysical community, whatever you want to call it. There's always one. There's always one who will have a problem with something. But that makes a lot of sense. It's bringing it up to date and making it accessible for people. That makes a lot of sense. And I think the one thing I would really like to ask is obviously kind of you're a theosophist, so Blavatsky is I guess a core text for you in that regard, but Blavatsky's work rather. Taking apart kind of the process that you used to do this, to look at each sentence, to modernize it, to unpack it, and then again to kind of bring that who's who to life with the text. What was, looking back on that process, what was the thing that surprised you the most? What kind of really gave you fresh eyes on the corpus of work, or indeed kind of just something that you a kernel that may have not been prevalent before?
I think really there were two things. One was that it was tremendous fun. I mean, it really is a roller coaster ride, through this amazing world, because you've got the conflict between science and spiritualism at the time. You've got a whole kind of panorama of ancient texts and different belief systems. You've got the idea of cycles of the universe. You've got cataclysms. You've got Atlantis, you've got the Lemurians, you've got all of this marvelous stuff all contained just in these first 7 chapters. So it really is so rich and colorful, I found. And also the other thing that really surprised me was, I think particularly with Isis Unveiled, is it's such a historical document. It shows you exactly what was happening around 1877, and those kind of the late 19th century. In terms of the Victorians' obsession with the supernatural, and particularly with seances and spiritualism. I mean, there were spirits who were kind of like celebrities, like Katie King and John King were mentioned in the national press and in the international press, and there was this huge debate raging around, scientists investigating spiritual phenomena. So it was just a marvelous kind of roller coaster ride, and a real kind of window into what it was like. You can almost reach out and touch it sometimes. You actually feel like you were there, in the way that she describes, different people talking about their views, and the skeptics and the non-skeptics, and this whole kind of thing that was going on. And you've also got mesmer and the whole thing around mesmerism, and the French Academy is investigating mesmer. So it's really rich and colorful. And I think that's something that that we don't always think about Blavatsky. We think it's almost like you're going in and you're having a tutorial almost, but there's this kind of richness and adventure in the whole thing, which I think is very easy to miss, when you're kind of dipping in and dipping out to tiny little bits.
So some of our listeners may have not picked up a copy of Blavatsky's work. Just to kind of help orientate people, can you, tell us who Blavatsky is?
Well, Blavatsky was a Ukrainian mystic, and she was born. She was born in 1830 in the Ukraine, and she, when she was very young, she experienced supernatural visits from beings who she described as her hunchbacks, and she was very kind of not of this world in many respects. And she was always on a quest. When she was very young, when she was a teenager, she went to stay with her grandfather, and he had this enormous library which contained lots and lots of occult books, and she literally devoured them. I mean, she was absolutely fascinated with them. And when she was older, she went on a journey across the world. I mean, she was from quite an affluent family, so she had those resources. She was fortunate enough in that respect. But she went on this quest to look at why we're here, the whole ideas of cosmogony and all the different belief systems. She went to Tibet. She went to South America. She traveled everywhere, and she met lots of different people, and she read lots of different books. And in Tibet, she discovered secret texts, which she then shared with the world, or the ideas of those texts she shared with the world in a book called The Secret Doctrine, which is really her magnum opus. But what she did was she kind of brought to the West all of these ideas around Eastern mysticism and ancient mysticism, which were kind of being dismissed at the time. There was this idea in the air in England and European countries and in America that being white and European and being Western made you superior to everybody else. And Blavatsky was saying that when people who were Victorians, for example, and in the British Raj were saying that the ideas that people had around spirituality in India were inferior, and savage was a word that they used often. She said, no, their ideas and their belief system is equal to, if not superior in some ways, to the ideas of exoteric Christianity. So people often say that the whole kind of modern movement around spirituality, you always find your way back to Blavatsky, because she was the person that brought that kind of comparative study of religions and said they've all got a single root. So she was quite groundbreaking in that respect, in what she did. And at the time, when she formed the Theosophical Society in 1875, and the objects of the Theosophical Society were quite modern, really. I mean, the idea of the whole of humanity being a universal brotherhood, regardless of race and regardless of nationality and religion and gender. Those kind of things were not really the majority view at the time. So her ideas were very revolutionary, and she was very challenging. And that's why, there were a lot of people that were out to kind of discredit her and dismiss her.
Certainly, looking at the time frame, I mean, as despite her, I guess, privileged background, doing that kind of work as a woman at the time, traveling, I mean, globally traveling, I mean, to significantly remote areas. I mean, India is hard to travel around now. I can only imagine what it was like in Blavatsky's time, but you can really admire the drive and courage to go and explore and seek out in the way she did. And I think that's something I'd really like to unpack, that the knowledge of looking back through time and pulling together this great narrative back into the past. You touched on something when you were just talking about the book, in terms of things like the cataclysms, ancient history, and that's a topic that I just adore. and I really can't get enough of. So could you talk to that a bit? That kind of that knowledge that she brought back from her travels in India and Tibet, around the ancient world.
Yeah, I mean, she particularly talked about ancient Egypt being a center of knowledge, and Pythagoras and Jesus and Moses kind of learning a lot of things from ancient Egypt, and also the idea of humanity being incredibly old and not necessarily following the path that we've been led to believe that it follows. So she talks about ancient races. She talks about Atlantis. She talks about, the Lemurians before the Atlanteans, and then other kind of versions of humanity before that. And what she very much emphasizes is the idea that our progress and our evolution works in cycles. So we build up to a certain point, and then humanity or the civilization at the time is devastated by either fire or water. So obviously the Atlanteans were destroyed by water, their civilization. That was the cataclysm. And then looking at the current situation for us, our cataclysm, when it eventually comes to kind of rebalance and reset for the next cycle, will be fire. And there are certain parallels, obviously, today with global warming and with the situation with nuclear weapons and that kind of thing that makes one wonder, is that kind of an indicator of where we might be headed for that next end of the cycle. But what I find really, really fascinating is that she pulls all of these ideas together. She will look at symbolism in different religions, and she'll pull it all together to say that, for example, talking about the existence of giants in the past, she'll talk about Hinduism, and she'll talk about Christianity, and there's the stories in those different religions that look at the existence of giants and how they all kind of come back to those early races, and they describe them, but they describe them in different ways. She talks about in the Vedas, the first humans being giants, and that Brahman, one of the first humans, marries a giant called Daintony. And then she compares that with the Norse myths and the giants, the ice, the frost giants in the Norse myths. So she pulls all of these strands together in all of these ancient mythologies and traditions. They all seem to have similar things in their kind of depiction of the evolution of humanity.
It's really interesting that you pick on the giant stuff, because I was gonna kind of ask you about, really, how does theosophy and kind of the work you're doing, how does that align with, say, some of the work that Graham Hancock's done with things like the Younger Dryas, where we there he builds a very solid argument for kind of there was a celestial impact and then absolute kind of unbelievable cataclysm that was flood based, and pulls together kind of the geographical evidence for that. But then you went on to mention giants. So you've picked on two of, like, my favorite subjects to explore, which I'm not sure you're familiar with, the kind of the work of Andrew Collins and Dr. Gregory Little, and they've pulled together a book called Denisvian. I just can't pronounce it. Every time I try, I always make a balls of trying to pronounce this word. Denisovian origins, and it's basically related to a cave in Russia where they found kind of some molar teeth for a humanoid, a hominid, which is immense. It's a very large hominid, or human. Really, it's very close to a modern human, and trace that DNA out through kind of Europe and into the Americas. But they reckon the stature of these particular human beings were kind of regularly kind of 7 foot plus. So there are reasonable archaeological arcs now to support both the idea of a deluge and the idea of human beings of immense stature, or a branch of the human family, really, of immense stature. And I was wondering, is that something that Theosophy is plotting into the work of Blavatsky, or are they seeing those correlations in say some of the modern research that's happening at the moment?
Well, Theosophy looks in particular in terms of human evolution at the human race kind of descending from the celestial and coming more and more into the material and becoming, at the moment, we're at the bottom of the what we call the involutionary cycle. So we are very, very materialistic, and the Atlanteans were very materialistic. So we've kind of inherited a little bit of that in terms of our materialism and obsession with glamour and all of those things nowadays. But for Theosophists, the Atlanteans were bigger than we were, and before them there were the Lemurians, who were bigger than the Atlanteans, and it was only in the Lemurian period that humanity separated out into male and female. So the Lemurians began as giants, but they didn't reproduce in the way that we do now. So Theosophy does kind of follow that arc of humanity getting smaller and also becoming more materialistic. And the original human race was kind of non-corporeal, really kind of gaseous to begin with. So that's all kind of linked in with the idea of chains and rounds, which is an absolute nightmare of a complicated subject as well, because you've got the kind of the planet Earth becoming more solidified, and you've got the different versions of the planet Earth, the ethereal, the astral, all of those kind of things, and that's all linked in with that cycle of evolution. So it's an immense and it's a bit like spaghetti junction, trying to kind of unpick bits of it and untangle bits of it is quite a job, really. But that is a big part of the theosophical picture of humanity's evolution, is that before our kind of era of humanity, human beings were much bigger. I recently read Colin Wilson's book on Atlantis, and he was talking about, much like you was talking about the evidence, the archaeological evidence, for example, of human beings being around a lot earlier than we've been led to believe. So I think he actually said that the amount of kind of bones of dinosaurs and humans that have been found is something like less than 1% of what's actually out there. So we really don't have a full picture of what things were really like and how we really were in those kind of in those times that are so immensely far away from us now.
Yeah, I mean there is a huge amount of kind of like out of time artifacts, things that don't make sense, and it's really interesting looking at kind of the story of time and the story of humanity that Blavatsky lays out, and I was quite interested in how it's like a parallel narrative at the same time when kind of a scientific narrative was being laid out in this during the same period in terms of kind of humanity's progress and humanity's evolution, but also kind of like this waterfall progress of time, where there was an absolute start and then intermittent stages and where we are. But this assumption that there was an absolute start, that there kind of is an assumption around the time frame of that absolute start, more importantly. And there's just been this really kind of dogmatic scientific devotion to that idea of like, this is the time frame and that's it, and anything that actually doesn't fit into that time frame, doesn't fit into that narrative, we just ignore, or we claim fraud. But actually there's a vast amount of archaeological artifacts that support broadly that it isn't the case at all, that we're far older than the several 100,000 years that we're credited with, or indeed kind of like modern human beings as being kind of around for a relatively short period of time in terms of antiquity. But what Blavatsky is painting is a picture of hundreds of thousands of years going way back. And back to the root races, and we're talking about various different root races. Actually, might be useful for people as well. Can you talk to the idea of root races and the kind of the different ages and how that fits together?
Yeah, I mean the root races really is, I suppose in a way, race is a bit of an unfortunate term for it, because what it's kind of describing is an era of humanity. So at the moment, I mean, you had the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, and now we are in the fifth root race, and we are the Aryans, and that's obviously an unfortunate term as well, because obviously it was adopted by certain people to kind of link them back to where the Aryans originally started from, which was in the Indian subcontinent or around there, and to kind of justify certain political views and certain political agendas in order to say that certain people had this ancient link and that made them superior to everybody else. So at the moment we're in that particular race, but when we talk about root races, it's kind of an era of humanity. That's how I think of it, really, because what Blavatsky says, interestingly, coming back to the idea of, the evidence from archaeology, is she says that humanity doesn't necessarily evolve in these different time periods all at the same time. And she says that, if an archaeologist, if we were all destroyed or there was another cataclysm very soon, and an archaeologist went to a remote island where a group of people weren't particularly advanced, if the archaeologist said, well, that was how human beings were in 2020, then they're giving a false picture, because there's those people living there and there's, other people living at a different level. I mean, it comes back to that whole thing of what do they call them, cargo cultures, where something falls off a cargo plane in the middle of
the Pacific Islands, right? Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So what Blavatsky is saying is that humanity isn't all moving at the same speed at the same time. People are at different stages. So really, the idea of the root races is a kind of era of humanity, and the root races go back to the first and second root races, who were kind of not really that physically formed. They were more ethereal and non-corporeal. And then you had the third root race, which is the Lemurians, and then the fourth root race, which is primarily the Atlanteans, and then we're now in the fifth root race, and then there will be another two that will develop, and we're now at the bottom of the kind of the involutionary arc. So we're just past that point of being as material and obsessed with the material world as we can possibly be. And as we move upwards, we'll develop more kind of what people might describe as, I don't know, supernatural, spooky powers, more telepathy, more ability to read each other's thoughts and communicate in that way as we move into the sixth and seventh eras of humanity, or root races, if you like.
And did Blavatsky have any kind of like predictions around that kind of timeline for us to develop into the next version of ourselves?
She did, and it's immense, and I can't exactly remember what it is right now. But what she talks about is it's a Sanskrit word called Manvantara, and that is a huge period of time which includes all of these cycles. So you've got the cataclysms and the development of humanity, and right from the beginning of the appearance of our Earth and the appearance of our universe. And that's all part of a huge period of time, which is billions and billions of years, which is a Manvantara. And then it all goes back to nothingness again, and all starts up, and has a period which is called a pralaya, which is kind of a rest period where there's literally no manifestation, and then the universe starts to to manifest and appear again. And that's something which science is kind of thinking about now, that kind of idea of expansion and contraction, and universes going in cycles. So a lot of what she was talking about is kind of appearing in kind of scientific theory now, and what people are talking about now. She was hinting at back in the 1870s and 1880s.
Yeah, it's really intriguing stuff, and to that point you made earlier about presenting this Eastern view of things that you know would have been far broader in scope, and explicitly in terms of the example of time, than kind of say with the Western Christian view of things. She must have met an awful lot of resistance to these ideas, not least because of her gender, but then secondly, kind of bringing forth these ideas that were absolutely perpendicular to I guess the thinking of the day.
Yeah, I mean, she had a lot of enemies, particularly when she moved to Adyar in India and set up the headquarters of the Theosophical Society. The British Raj hated her because not only did she kind of say to people in India that they should be ignoring the Christian missionaries and sort of embracing their own religious traditions. And she also says that the Vedas and that outdate the Bible. The Bible, if anything, borrows from the Vedas in many ways, with its kind of its mythologies and ideas. And she upset the British Raj, and she basically was talking about the fact that she felt the Raj should get out of India and let India run its own affairs. And Annie Besant, who became the president of the Theosophical Society, carried on in that vein. And Gandhi was a member of the Theosophical Society. He was an associate member. When he met Blavatsky, he was so impressed with her ideas about, the importance of accepting Eastern ideas as well as Western ideas on religion and mythology, and also her ideas about universal brotherhood and her kind of ideas around everybody being a brotherhood / sisterhood, in terms of race and religion. Everyone is still equal and everyone is still part of a collective humanity. And these just weren't ideas that were that acceptable at the time. And I remember reading somewhere that when she was in London, she started a magazine which was called Lucifer, meaning obviously light bringer. And the Church of England banned it. It wasn't allowed to be sold in public because it was obviously a non-Christian magazine, and also it was called Lucifer. So they got in quite a knot about it, and they banned it from sale in kiosks. So she had to sell it privately and kind of circulate it privately.
I love it. I'm just, I mean, that's very punk. She clearly was doing her own thing, and that was it. I'm an admirer of that. In the chapter index of the book, there's a huge amount of really interesting subject matter. I mean, it's an incredible array of subjects, really. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that in chapter 5, there's reference to Solomon and Sheba. So in kind of the history of this podcast, it kind of comes from exploring kind of jinn lore, and obviously there's a big big piece of jinn lore around the Queen of Sheba, or Belquis. So I wanted to kind of ask you, what does Blavatsky talk about in terms of Solomon and Sheba?
She doesn't actually talk in any great detail, really. She mentions Solomon and Sheba as kind of a kind of an aside thing that kind of supports other things that she's talking about. I mean, to be honest, I'd have to look again at the passages to see exactly what she does say, because she covers so many subjects that it's really kind of, she jumps from one thing to another. You've got Bruno there, you've got creation myth and water, you've got Kavinda Sami, and Indian fakirs. And she talks about Solomon and Sheba very, very briefly. So I think it's just like a couple of, literally a couple of lines that she mentions, really. So
Okay.
I can't really
That's
go into
no
detail
worries.
without looking at the exact passages, really. I can call them up now on a PDF.
Well, I mean, to that end, I mean, in terms of kind of the subject matter of kind of this podcast, like there's also kind of a reference to mischievous spirits and kind of the invisible world and kind of spirits in general. So, what was her view of that whole spectrum?
Yeah, she's definitely got a very, very strong view on that. I can talk to you about that at some length. I mean, what she talks about, she first of all talks about how there are two kinds of spirit entity. So she talks about something called elementals and then elementaries. So if a person dies, their personality, which isn't their actual core essence, isn't their spirit, their personality that they've had in this particular incarnation, remains for a time in the astral plane, on another plane of existence. So it's kind of like, when you take your clothes off and you leave them lying over the back of the chair, somebody else can come and put them on. And what she talks about is that the elemental is that part of you, if you've died, that's left, that kind of vibration of your personal desires and your memories and your attitudes is kind of left lying around until it eventually disintegrates over time. And then there are these, that's the elementary. Then there are these spirits or forces of nature, she says, which are called elementals, and they can kind of pick up your old skin, your old personality, and literally travel around as you. And she says that is the kind of thing when spirits appear at seances, for example, she was saying that it's not necessarily the person who is departed that you're speaking to. It may be an elemental which is in the clothing of somebody who has departed. So an elemental will wear take over the elementary, which is the vibrational essence of your personality which has left. And she says elementals can be very, very mischievous and very trickster-like. But when you speak to them, they will tell you all sorts of things, that the deceased person knows, because they're wearing the personality and that they've got the memories of that person. They've picked them up. So she talks also about these things called the diaka. Have you heard of those? There was a medium called Andrew Jackson Davis, who talked about the same thing. He said that the diaka were evil spirits that dwelled in a place called Summerland, and they delighted in deceiving people. And he says that their view of life was that they wanted to engage in this idea of delicious destruction, playing havoc with people. And he said that they can impersonate people in the same way that Blavatsky was talking about elementals, taking over an elementary. Yes, so she talks about spirits in those kind of terms, kind of forces of nature, she says, that can take over or masquerade as somebody or something, an animal, for example, that was alive but isn't anymore.
And her view of I mean, because I guess spiritualism was happening around the same time and kind of growing as a tradition. What was her view of spiritualism as a whole, and was that something that she partook in and supported?
She originally worked as a medium, and then she looked on spiritualist manifestations as real things. So she said, okay, there were fraudulent mediums at the time, and the scientific community and the press delighted in exposing fraudulent mediums. But she said that there were other mediums who were genuine, and that supernatural phenomenon that took place at seances were real supernatural phenomenon. Or she always says that these things are not necessarily supernatural, they're just aspects of nature. It's natural law, aspects of natural law that we don't yet understand completely. So her view of spiritualism was that these manifestations were real, but that the manifestations were not always the actual deceased person. It could be a mischievous spirit that's impersonating, wearing the clothing of the deceased person. Not always, but she said that the majority of the time that was the case, which wouldn't have made her that popular, I would have thought, with a number of people in the spiritualist community. But that was the position that she took.
And then on the topic of invisible worlds, which obviously is hugely broad, what were her thoughts on that?
Well, she quotes so many different books, and there are passages of other books that are actually in her text, and sometimes you actually think it's her writing, but it's a big chunk of somebody else's book, because copyright laws weren't necessarily as stringent in those days as they are today. So there are these two writers called Balfour Stewart and Peter Guthrie Tate, and they wrote a book called The Unseen Universe, and they talked about the idea of there being lots and lots of parallel universes, parallel worlds, and she was very supportive of that idea, because obviously that kind of fits into the whole chains and rounds idea of the fact that or the idea that the physical Earth as we know it is just one of 7 planet Earths, and there are 6 others occupying the space, this same space, but we can't see them. But we visit them at different times during our existence because we vibrate at different levels. So we move from one vibratory level to another, and the material planet Earth that we know at the moment is a very kind of dense vibration, a very heavy vibration. But there are other planet Earths where, for example, the astral Earth, there are all sorts of entities that exist on the astral Earth, and it's the first place you visit after you leave this particular incarnation. In between this incarnation and your next one, it's the first place that you go to. And she says later on in Isis Unveiled, she talks about kind of vampiric entities and even werewolves. And all of those kind of amazing mystical kind of supernatural things existing on these different versions of the Earth beyond the material plane.
What was her view of vampiric entities? What were they? What did they want?
Well, really, she's talking about, as you say, the idea of kind of negative energies and things feeding off of human energy. So, again, looking at those ideas of the elementaries and the elementals, they're kind of feeding, they're attracted to that human energy, and they're attracted to kind of those negative things about us, our kind of deeper and darker desires. And I think that's really where she's coming from, as you said, quite rightly, I think, in terms of the ideas of kind of things feeding off of, a bit like sort of maggots feeding off dead carcasses, feeding off that dark energy, which is part of our nature. It's that kind of two-sided element of us. She talks about in terms of incarnation and reincarnation, the aim is that we get lighter and kind of less negative as we develop as human beings, and as human beings kind of go back up on that that evolutionary arc and become more ethereal and are able to communicate telepathically, etc., and become more kind of guardians of other beings coming up. And she says, that you've got to kind of watch out in a way, because if you if you kind of fall down and keep falling down and kind of embrace the darker side, that you won't be able to carry on incarnating and developing, and you'll kind of go in reverse and end up in kind of quite a dark abyss almost. And she doesn't really make it that clear how you get out of it, or indeed if you do get out of it, because if you go so far into that dark side, you're kind of drawn deeper and deeper and deeper, and it becomes harder and harder to get out of it. So there is a kind of like, a warning in there in terms of growth and development being in a particular direction. And of course she talks about different kind of living beings. She says everything is living, so kind of minerals are living, plants are living, and obviously animals are the humans that will come into existence, because we've all been animals, we've all been plants. Our psychic energy and our spirit energy has come through all of those different life waves to where we are today. But as in terms of the human race, we don't kind of go back to those different life waves, but you can kind of, end up on a dark path, which can lead to quite disastrous results.
And when she's talking about those disastrous results, and we talk about kind of like looking at human evolution and what you were talking about, spiritual evolution earlier in terms of how we will evolve and kind of develop our psychic powers and become kind of less, I guess, corporeal, and that kind of projected path. The reverse of that, so as you described, falling into some kind of abyss and going further and further away from the light, maybe as a broad term, and falling into kind of the darker states. What does that bring with it? We know you established that it's hard to come back, but how does that change the person, the soul? What do they become?
I think you basically become more and more kind of addicted to darkness. So you kind of become more of a force of darkness than a person. I mean, personally, I think that my own view as a theosophist is that everybody can kind of turn it around and move back. But I think what Blavatsky is talking about is this idea that you kind of lose your humanity completely because you kind of disconnected yourself from it. So you're no longer able to kind of develop with the rest of humanity, and you become something else which is much kind of more feral, feral and sort of more kind of dark energy, which is not really where you'd necessarily want to end up.
Yeah, it's a regular theme on this show. We able to kind of pull that thread and kind of understand kind of what's going on, because people have lots of negative experiences with spirits. There's lots of great ones too, but it's trying to understand kind of, well, what is interacting with us? What are its motivations? Some things are predatorial, some things are not. And as you pointed out earlier, discussing with the idea of elementals and elementaries, that spirits lie all the time. There's plenty of stories of people undertaking kind of very complex or long protracted instructions and carrying them out, and to find out nothing happens. They've just had their time wasted. And as you said, that kind of trickster element is really relevant. But beyond that, there's also that kind of predatory thing, that is destruction. And certainly that's resonated both in the Bible and the Quran. When I'm paraphrasing now, but in the Quran, after Iblis falls and is cast out by Allah, he talks about kind of waiting on the path for human beings and beset them on all sides. So that predatory element seems to be tied through kind of all the kind of major religions, that there is something there that is adversarial. But it's interesting to hear from the Theosophist perspective that is us. That's us if we've made terrible decisions and not looked at turning them around.
Yeah, I mean, from a theosophist point of view, everything really is us, because we are, we are part of that universal consciousness. We came from the absolute consciousness, which kind of manifested the universe that we have today and the entire cosmos. And so we are everything, really. So, I mean, you look at rocks and plants, and you look at animals, it's us. They are the future human beings. They are coming through. Atoms, we started out as atoms, and then we grew and grew and grew and came through in these different life waves. So everything that exists is part of the absolute and the divine spiritual energy, and we are part of that. So yeah, and from a theosophist point of view, we are it. We are everything, and everything is embodied in us. So that's really the broader thing that Blavatsky is talking about in terms of brotherhood. It doesn't just include humanity. I mean, humanity for theosophists are kind of the custodians of the earth and of all the creatures, and all of the whole planet. And are we failing in our job at the moment of being custodians for the planet? So these are all kind of questions that are quite important from a theosophical point of view.
Thank you. One other bit you talk to in chapter 2 is the idea of will and the divine idea. Now, within Telema, like will is a huge concept. Like and do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law and whatnot. How does Theosophy look at the concept of will? What did Blavatsky think of it?
Well, Blavatsky was talking about the idea of thought forms and the idea of thoughts having a kind of vibrational energy, because everything that exists has a vibrational energy and has a power to it and has a life to it. So every thought that you think has a power and a life to it, and it goes out into the universe, goes out into the ether, and eventually it grows into something. So thought and the way that you think and the way that you apply your thoughts and the way that you direct yourself is incredibly important, because very much included and bound up with the ideas of theosophy are the ideas of karma. So that includes what you say and do, but also what you think. So even if you look at the New Thought movement, and a number of years ago, I was very deeply into the ideas of New Thought and The Secret and Louise Hay, and all of these kind of the people who were talking about the power of thought and the power of the law of attraction, etc.
What's New Thought? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, New Thought. Well, New Thought. Have you heard of The Secret? Yeah. New Thought is basically what Rhonda Byrne was talking about in The Secret, that your thoughts have a vibrational energy, and everything is based around the law of attraction. So if you say and think good things and you act in a good way, then it will bounce back to you. Good things will happen, and you can basically say affirmations and make things happen by repeating those affirmations and focusing those thoughts. And she wasn't the first person who came up with that. That was actually something which appeared shortly after Blavatsky, with people like Florence Scovel Shinn, who were talking in the 1920s and 1930s about the power of the mind and the power of thought. And there was a guy whose name I forget, but he wrote a book called The Master Key System. And The Master Key System, I think, was a book from the 1930s. And basically, Rhonda Byrne has taken it and made it into The Secret. She hasn't plagiarized it, but she's taken the ideas of it. So new thought, although, you know, it's got the word new in it, isn't very new because it's over 100 years old, you know. And Blavatsky was talking about it in Isis Unveiled, you know, and she was, and also Balfour Stewart and Peter Guthrie Tate were talking in their book, The Unseen Universe, about the power of the mind and thought waves traveling out and having a vibrational frequency. So again, you know, you can trace a lot of these things back much earlier. You can trace them back to Blavatsky, and you can trace them back to the people that Blavatsky was reading and that Blavatsky was referencing. So yeah, I mean, so the power of will and the power of thought is an incredibly important thing for Blavatsky. And she talks about the divine will creating things in all of the different religions, you know, the idea of the divine will creating stuff out of the darkness and you know, kind of over the waters. And she also talks about the idea that because we are sparks of the divine, we have that ability within us. But at the moment, we use it without really thinking about it, you know, because our thoughts are running away all the time, and we don't kind of, you know, stop and think what their consequences are, as a result of what we're thinking and doing and what we're saying. So she was kind of flagging up this idea that as sparks of the divine and coming from the divine will, we also have that ability to influence reality through our own thoughts and through the power of our own wills. But it's really in its infancy in terms of us getting hold of it and really understanding it and using it, you know, in the right way almost.
And to that end, you know, what were her views on magic? Was she a practicing magician?
She felt that magic was natural law. So she used natural law to manifest things. There's the famous story about the teacup. You know, when she went on a journey with some friends in India, and someone extra came along, and there wasn't enough stuff for them, you know, to join in the picnic. And they said, oh, you know, we're short of a teacup and a saucer. And she said, well, you know, if you dig over there near that tree, you'll find a teacup and a saucer. And lo and behold, there was a teacup and a saucer there, exactly the same as the ones that had already been packed up for this picnic. And people were saying that, you know, she couldn't have necessarily known because the person who came, you know, wasn't expected to be there, and they stopped at a random place. So she did, you know, use certain supernatural powers that she was able to kind of use them for manifestation, etc. But her view was these were things that are just part of natural law, and we don't understand them yet. So you know, she was saying there's nothing really kind of spooky, if you want, you know, spooky in inverted commas about them. It's just that we are so material now, you know, we are at such a kind of low vibrational energy of materialism in this kind of the stage that we're at in humanity, that we've lost those abilities. You know, the Lemurians had those abilities, the Atlanteans had those abilities, but they didn't use them for good. And over time, we've kind of lost those abilities, but now we're back on that upward arc to kind of discover those abilities again. And I suppose in a way, the whole kind of idea of new thought and using the mind to focus on things and seeing what manifests, and, you know, finding out what you can actually manifest through your own thoughts is kind of like the new baby steps in that process.
I like that. So to wrap up, where is if people wanted to find the book and find out more about you, where can they find you?
Well, the book is available anywhere. You can get it in any bookshop. You can also get it, you know, digitally if you wanted to go on Amazon. If you felt that you enjoyed Amazon and you wanted to get it on Amazon, then you can get it on Amazon. And if you wanted to get it from the Theosophical Society, they've got it as well. So if you wanted to give them a hand, then that'd be a great place to go. The Theosophical Society bookshop.
And then too, if they wanted to follow you or contact you, are you on the interwebs? Are you tweeting?
No, I don't tweet. I'm not. I've not really got a presence on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or anything.
I commend you. I commend you. You've got the triple threat down. I'm only on 2, but wiping out 3. That's pretty impressive going.
Yeah, I was on it for a while, and then I couldn't keep up with it. So I thought, oh, do you know what? I'll leave. Like Greta Garbo, I'll just leave.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting talking to you, and again, I commend you on the work, and particularly the scope and breadth of it is vast. And just like looking through the index in terms of of what you guys sent through to me, just looking at the index is almost overwhelming. I can't even imagine what it begins to feel like taking that on. So yeah, fantastic work. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for coming on the Spirit Box.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Moon Laramie. I really enjoyed that. If you want to pick up a copy of the book, you can do so in the links in the show notes. There's a link to the Theosophical Society and to Treadwell's London, both of whom stock the book. And, give the little shops your love. Uncle Jeff doesn't need any more pocket money. He's okay. Amazon will survive. Our little bookstores need all the love, so let's give them some support. That's it from me. Again, I hope you enjoyed the show, and stay tuned. Talk soon. Bye.